On the march again. Africa, Africa, was the terrible word that echoed and re-echoed in the mind of Dick Sands. As he pondered over the events of the preceding weeks, he could now understand why, notwithstanding the rapid progress of the ship, the land seemed ever to be receding, and why the voyage had been prolonged to twice its anticipated length. It remained, however, a mystery inexplicable as before, how and when they had rounded Cape Horn and passed into another ocean. Suddenly, the idea flashed upon him that the compass must have been tampered with, and he remembered the fall of the first compass. He recalled the night when he had been roused by Tom's cry of alarm that Negoro had fallen against the binnacle. As he recollected these circumstances, he became more and more convinced that it was Negoro who was the mainspring of all the mischief, that it was he who had contrived the loss of the Pilgrim and compromised the safety of all on board. What had been the career, what could be the motives of a man who was capable of such vile machinations? But shrouded in mystery, as were the events of the past, the present offered a prospect equally obscure. Beyond the fact that he was in Africa and 100 miles from the coast, Dick knew absolutely nothing. He could only conjecture that he was in the fatal province of Angola, and assured as he was that Harris had acted the traitor, he was led to the conclusion that he and Negoro had been playing into each other's hands. The result of the collision, he feared, might be very disastrous to the survivors of the Pilgrim. Yet, in what manner would the odious stratagem be accomplished? Dick could well understand that the Negroes would be sold for slaves. He could only too easily imagine that upon himself Negoro would wreak the vengeance he had so obviously been contemplating. But for Mrs. Weldon and the other helpless members of the party, what fate could be in store? The situation was terrible, but yet Dick did not flinch. He had been appointed captain, and captain he would remain. Mrs. Weldon and her little son had been committed to his charge, and he was resolved to carry out his trust faithfully to the end. For several hours he remained wrapped in thought, pondering over the present and the future, weighing the evil chances against the good, only to be convinced that the evil much preponderated. At length he rose, firm, resolute, calm. The first glimmer of dawn was breaking upon the forest. All the rest of the party, except Tom, were fast asleep. Dick Sands crept softly up to the old Negro and whispered, "Tom, you know now where we are." "Yes, yes, Mr. Dick, only too well I know it. We are in Africa." The old man sighed mournfully. "Tom," said Dick, in the same low voice, "you must keep this a secret. You must not say a word to let Mrs. Weldon or any of the others know." The old man murmured his assent, and Dick continued, "It will be quite enough for them to learn that we have been betrayed by Harris, and that we must consequently practice extra care and watchfulness. They will merely think we are taking precautions against being surprised by nomad Indians. I trust to your good sense, Tom, to assist me in this. You may depend upon me, Mr. Dick, and I can promise you that we will all do our best to prove our courage and to show our devotion to your service. Illustration: you must keep this a secret." Thus assured of Tom's cooperation, Dick proceeded to deliberate upon his future line of action. He had every reason to believe that the treacherous American, startled by the traces of the slaves and the unexpected roaring of the lion, had taken flight before he had conducted his victims to the spot where they were to be attacked, and that consequently some hours might elapse before he would be joined by Negoro, who, to judge from Dingo's strange behavior, had undoubtedly for the last few days been somewhere on their track. Here was a delay that might be turned to good account, and no time was to be lost in taking advantage of it to commence their return journey to the coast. If, as Dick had every reason to suppose, he was in Angola, he hoped to find, either north or south, some Portuguese settlement whence he could obtain the means of transporting his party to their several homes. But how was this return journey to be accomplished? It would be difficult, not to say imprudent, to retrace their footsteps through the forest. It would merely bring them to their starting point, and would, moreover, afford an easy track for Negoro or his accomplices to follow. The safest and most secret means of reaching the coast would assuredly be by descending the course of some river. This would have to be effected by constructing a strong raft, from which the little party, well armed, might defend themselves alike from attacks either of the natives or of wild beasts, and which would likewise afford a comfortable means of transport for Mrs. Weldon and her little boy, who were now deprived of the use of Harris's horse. The Negroes, it is true, would be only too pleased to carry the lady on a litter of branches, but this would be to occupy the services of 2 out of 5, and under the circumstances, it was manifestly advisable that all hands should be free to act on the defensive. Another great inducement towards the plan was that Dick Sands felt himself much more at home in traveling by water than by land, and was longing to be once again upon what to him was, as it were, his native element. He little dreamt that he was devising for himself the very plan that Harris, in his speculations, had laid down for him. The most urgent matter was now to find such a stream as would suit their purpose. Dick had several reasons for feeling sure that one existed in the neighborhood. He knew that the little river, which fell into the Atlantic near the spot where the Pilgrim stranded, could not extend very far either to the north or east, because the horizon was bounded in both directions by the chain of mountains which he had taken for the Cordilleras. If the stream did not rise in those hills, it must incline to the south, so that in either case Dick was convinced he could not be long in discovering it, or one of its affluents. Another sign, which he recognized as hopeful, was that during the last few miles of the march the soil had become moist and level, whilst here and there the appearance of tiny rivulets indicated that an aqueous network existed in the subsoil. On the previous day, too, the caravan had skirted a rushing torrent, of which the waters were tinged with oxide of iron from its sloping banks. Dick's scheme was to make his way back as far as this stream, which though not navigable itself would in all probability empty itself into some affluent of greater importance. The idea, which he imparted to Tom, met with the old Negro's entire approval. As the day dawned, the sleepers, one by one, awoke. Mrs. Weldon laid little Jack in Nan's arms. The child was still dozing, the fever had abated, but he looked painfully white and exhausted after the attack. "Dick," said Mrs. Weldon after looking round her, "where is Mr. Harris? I cannot see him." "Harris has left us," answered Dick very quietly. "Do you mean that he has gone on ahead?" "No, madam, I mean that he has left us and gone away entirely. He is in league with Negoro." "In league with Negoro," cried Mrs. Weldon. "Ah, I have had a fancy lately that there has been something wrong. But why? What can be their motive?" "Indeed, I am unable to tell you," replied Dick. "I only—" Illustration: Harris has left us. Know that we have no alternative but to return to the coast immediately if we would escape the two rascals. "I only wish I could catch them," said Hercules, who had overheard the conversation. "I would soon knock their heads together," and he shook his two fists in giving emphasis to his words. "But what will become of my boy?" cried Mrs. Weldon, in tones of despondency. "I have been so sanguine in procuring him the comforts of San Felice." "Master Jack will be all right enough, madam, when we get into a more healthy situation near the coast," said Tom. "But is there no farm anywhere near, no village, no shelter?" she pleaded. "None whatever, madam. I can only repeat that it is absolutely necessary that we make the best of our way back to the seashore." "Are you quite sure, Dick, that Mr. Harris has deceived us?" Dirk felt that he should be glad to avoid any discussion on the subject, but with a warning glance at Tom, he proceeded to say that on the previous night he and Tom had discovered the American's treachery, and that if he had not instantly taken to his horse and fled he would have answered for his guilt with his life. Without, however, dwelling for a moment more than he could avoid upon the past, he hurried on to detail the means by which he now proposed to reach the sea, concluding by the assertion that he hoped a very few miles' march would bring them to a stream on which they might be able to embark. Mrs. Weldon, thoroughly ignoring her own weakness, professed her readiness not only to walk, but to carry Jack too. Bat and Austin at once volunteered to carry her in a litter. Of this the lady would not hear, and bravely repeated her intention of traveling on foot, announcing her willingness to start without further delay. Dick Sands was only too glad to assent to her wish. "Let me take Master Jack," said Hercules. "I shall be out of my element if I have nothing to carry." The giant, without waiting for a reply, took the child from Nan's arms so gently that he did not even rouse him from his slumber. The weapons were next carefully examined, and the provisions, having been repacked into one parcel, were consigned to the charge of Act-Aeon, who undertook to carry them on his back. Cousin Benedict, whose wiry limbs seemed capable of bearing any amount of fatigue, was quite ready to start. It was doubtful whether he had noticed Harris's disappearance. He was suffering from a loss which to him was of far greater importance. He had mislaid his spectacles and magnifying glass. It had happened that Bat had picked them up in the long grass, close to the spot where the amateur naturalist had been lying, but acting on a hint from Dick Sands, he said nothing about them. In this way the entomologist, who, without his glasses could scarcely see a yard beyond his face, might be expected to be kept without trouble in the limits of the ranks, and having been placed between Act Aeon and Austin with strict injunctions not to leave their side, he followed them as submissively as a blind man in leading strings. The start was made, but scarcely had the little troop advanced 50 yards upon their way when Tom suddenly cried out, "Where's Dingo?" With all the force of his tremendous lungs, Hercules gave a series of reverberating shouts. "Dingo, dingo, dingo." Not a bark could be distinguished in reply. "Dingo, dingo, dingo," again echoed in the air. But all was silence. Dick was intensely annoyed at the non-appearance of the dog. His presence would have been an additional safeguard in the event of any sudden surprise. "Perhaps he has followed Harris," suggested Tom. "Far more likely he is on the track of Negoro," rejoined Dick. "Then Negoro, to a dead certainty," said Hercules, "will put a bullet into his head." "It is to be hoped," replied Bat, "that Dingo will strangle him first." Dick Sands, disguising his vexation, said, "At any rate, we have no time to wait for the animal now. If he is alive, he will not fail to find us out. Move on, my lads, move on." The weather was very hot. Ever since daybreak heavy clouds had been gathering upon the horizon, and it seemed hardly likely that the day would pass without a storm. Fortunately, the woods were sufficiently light to ensure a certain amount of freshness to the surface of the soil. Here and there were large patches of tall, rank grass enclosed by clumps of forest trees. In some places, fossilized trunks, lying on the ground, betokened the existence of one of the coal districts that are common upon the continent of Africa. Along the glades, the carpet of verdure was relieved by crimson stems and a variety of flowers. Ginger blossoms, blue and yellow, pale lobelias, and red orchids fertilized by the numerous insects that incessantly hovered about them. The trees did not grow in impenetrable masses of one species, but exhibited themselves in infinite variety. There was also a species of palm producing an oil locally much valued. There were cotton plants growing in bushes 8 or 10 feet high, the cotton attached in long shreds to the ligneous stalks, and there were copals from which, pierced by the proboscis of certain insects, exudes an odorous resin that flows onto the ground and is collected by the natives. Then there were citrons and wild pomegranates and a score of other arborescent plants, all testifying to the fertility of this plateau of Central Africa. In many places, too, the air was fragrant with the odor of vanilla, though it was not possible to discover the shrub from which the perfume emanated. In spite of it being the dry season, so that the soil had only been moistened by occasional storms, all trees and plants were flourishing in great luxuriance. It was the time of year for fever, but according to Dr. Livingstone's observation, the disorder may generally be cured by quitting the locality where it has been contracted. Dick expressed his hope that, in little Jack's case, the words of the great traveler would be verified, and in encouragement of this sanguine view, pointed out to Mrs. Weldon that although it was past the time for the periodical return of the fever, the child was still slumbering quietly in Hercules' arms. The march was continued with as much rapidity as was consistent with caution. Occasionally, where the bushes and brushwood had been broken down by the recent passage of men or beasts, progress was comparatively easy, but much more frequently, greatly to Dick's annoyance, obstacles of various sorts impeded their advance. Climbing plants grew in such inextricable confusion that they could only be compared to a ship's rigging involved in hopeless entanglement. There were creepers resembling curved scimitars, thickly covered with sharp thorns. There were likewise strange growths, like vegetable serpents, 50 or 60 feet long, which seemed to have a cruel faculty for torturing every passenger with their prickly spines. Axe in hand, the Negroes had repeatedly to cut their road through these bewildering obstructions that clothed the trees from their summit to their base. Animal life was no less remarkable in its way than the vegetation. Birds in great variety flitted about in the ample foliage, secure from any stray shot from the little band, whose chief object it was to preserve its incognito. Guinea fowls were seen in considerable numbers, francolins in several varieties, and a few specimens of the bird to which the Americans, in imitation of their note, have given the name of whip-poor-will. If Dick had not had too much evidence in other ways to the contrary, he might almost have imagined himself in a province of the New World. Hitherto they had been unmolested by any dangerous wild beasts. During the present stage of their march, a herd of giraffes, startled by their unexpected approach, rushed fleetly past, this time, however, without being represented as ostriches. Occasionally, a dense cloud of dust on the edge of the prairie, accompanied by a sound like the roll of heavily laden chariots, betokened the flight of a herd of buffaloes, but with these exceptions, no animal of any magnitude appeared in view. For about 2 miles Dick followed the course of the rivulet, in the hope that it would emerge into a more important stream, which would convey them without much difficulty or danger direct to the sea. Towards noon about 3 miles had been accomplished, and a halt was made for rest. Neither Negoro nor Harris had been seen, nor had Dingo reappeared. The encampment for the midday refreshment was made under the shelter of a clump of bamboos, which effectually concealed them all. Few words were spoken during the meal. Mrs. Weldon could eat nothing. She had again taken her little boy into her arms and seemed wholly absorbed in watching him. Again and again, Dick begged her to take some nourishment, urging upon her the necessity of keeping up her strength. "We shall not be long in finding a good current to carry us to the coast," said the lad brightly. Mrs. Weldon raised her eyes to his animated features. With so sanguine and resolute a leader, with such devoted servants as the 5 Negroes in attendance, she felt that she ought not utterly to despair. Was she not, after all, on friendly soil? What great harm could Harris perpetrate against her or her belongings? She would hope still, hope for the best. Rejoiced as he was to see something of its former brightness return to her countenance, Dick nevertheless had scarcely courage steadily to return her searching gaze. Had she known the whole truth, he knew that her heart must fail her utterly. Chapter 4. Rough Traveling. Just at this moment, Jack woke up and put his arms round his mother's neck. His eyes were brighter, and there was manifestly no return of fever. "You are better, darling," said Mrs. Weldon, pressing him tenderly to her. "Yes, Mamma, I am better, but I am very thirsty." Some cold water was soon procured, which the child drank eagerly, and then began to look about him. His first inquiry was for his old friends, Dick and Hercules, both of whom approached at his summons and greeted him affectionately. "Where is the horse?" was the next question. "Gone away, Master Jack. I am your horse now," said Hercules. "But you have no bridle for me to hold," said Jack, looking rather disappointed. "You may put a bit in my mouth if you like, Master Jack," replied Hercules, extending his jaws, "and then you may pull as hard as you please." "Oh, I shall not pull very hard," said Jack, "but haven't we nearly come to Mr. Harris's farm?" Mrs. Weldon assured the child that they should soon be where they wanted to be, and Dick, finding that the conversation was approaching dangerous ground, proposed that the journey should be now resumed. Mrs. Weldon assented. The encampment was forthwith broken up, and the march continued as before. Illustration: it was a scene only too common in Central Africa. In order not to lose sight of the watercourse, it was necessary to cut a way right through the underwood. Progress was consequently very slow, and a little over a mile was all that was accomplished in about 3 hours. Footpaths had evidently once existed, but they had all become what the natives term dead, that is, they had become entirely overgrown with brushwood and brambles. The Negroes worked away with a will. Hercules, in particular, who temporarily resigned his charge to Nan, wielded his axe with marvelous effect, all the time giving vent to stentorian groans and grunts, and succeeded in opening the woods before him as if they were being consumed by a devouring fire. Fortunately, this heavy labor was not of very long duration. After about a mile, an opening of moderate width, converging towards the stream and following its bank, was discovered in the underwood. It was a passage formed by elephants, which apparently by hundreds must be in the habit of traversing this part of the forest. The spongy soil, soaked by the downpour of the rainy season, was everywhere indented with the enormous impressions of their feet. But it soon became evident that elephants were not the only living creatures that had used this track. Human bones gnawed by beasts of prey, whole human skeletons, still wearing the iron fetters of slavery, everywhere strewed the ground. It was a scene only too common in Central Africa, where like cattle driven to the slaughter, poor miserable men are dragged in caravans for hundreds of weary miles. to perish on the road in countless numbers beneath the traitor's lash, to succumb to the mingled horrors of fatigue, privation, and disease, or, if provisions fail, to be butchered, without pity or remorse, by sword and gun. That slave caravans had passed that way was too obvious to permit a doubt. For at least a mile, at almost every step Dick came in contact with the scattered bones, while ever and again huge goat-suckers, disturbed by the approach of the travelers, rose with flapping wings and circled round their heads. The youth's heart sank with secret dismay lest Mrs. Weldon should divine the meaning of this ghastly scene and appeal to him for explanation. But fortunately she had again insisted on carrying her little patient, and although the child was fast asleep, he absorbed her whole attention. Nan was by her side, almost equally engrossed. Old Tom alone was fully alive to the significance of his surroundings, and with downcast eyes he mournfully pursued his march. Full of amazement, the other Negroes looked right and left upon what might appear to them as the upheaval of some vast cemetery, but they uttered no word of inquiry or surprise. Meantime the bed of the stream had increased both in breadth and depth, and the rivulet had in a degree lost its character of a rushing torrent. This was a change which Dick Sands observed hopefully, interpreting it as an indication that it might itself become navigable, or would empty itself into some more important tributary of the Atlantic. His resolve was fixed. He would follow its course at all hazards. As soon, therefore, as he found that the elephant's track was quitting the water's edge, he made up his mind to abandon it, and had no hesitation in again resorting to the use of the axe. Once more, then, commenced the labor of cutting a way through the entanglement of bushes and creepers that were thick upon the soil. It was no longer forest through which they were wending their arduous path. Trees were comparatively rare. Only tall clumps of bamboos rose above the grass, so high, however, that even Hercules could not see above them, and the passage of the little troop could only have been discovered by the rustling in the stalks. In the course of the afternoon, the soil became soft and marshy. It was evident that the travelers were crossing plains that in a long rainy season must be inundated. The ground was carpeted with luxuriant mosses and graceful ferns, and the continual appearance of brown hematite wherever there was a rise in the soil betokened the existence of a rich vein of metal beneath. Remembering what he had read in Dr. Livingstone's account of these treacherous swamps, Dick bade his companions take their footing warily. He himself led the way. Tom expressed his surprise that the ground should be so soaked when there had been no rain for some time. "I think we shall have a storm soon," said Bat. "All the more reason then," replied Dick, "why we should get away from these marshes as quickly as possible. Carry Jack again, Hercules, and you, Bat and Austin, keep close to Mrs. Weldon so as to be able to assist her if she wants your help. But take care, Mr. Benedict." He cried out in sudden alarm, "What are you doing, sir?" "I'm slipping in," was poor Benedict's helpless reply. He had trodden upon a kind of quagmire, and, as though a trap had been opened beneath his feet, was fast disappearing into the slough. Assistance was immediately rendered, and the unfortunate naturalist was dragged out, covered with mud almost to his waist, but thoroughly satisfied because his precious box of specimens had suffered no injury. Act Aeon undertook for the future to keep close to his side and endeavor to avoid a repetition of the mishap. The accident could not be said to be altogether free from unpleasant consequences. Air bubbles in great numbers had risen to the surface of the mire from which Benedict had been extricated, and as they burst, they disseminated an odious stench that was well-nigh intolerable. The passage of these pestilential districts is not unfrequently very dangerous, and Livingstone, who on several occasions waded through them in mud that reached to his breast, compares them to great sponges composed of black porous earth, in which every footstep causes streams of moisture to ooze out. For well-nigh half a mile they had now to wend their cautious way across this spongy soil. Mrs. Weldon, ankle-deep in the soft mud, was at last compelled to come to a standstill, and Hercules, Bat, and Austin all resolved that she should be spared further discomfort, and insisted upon weaving some bamboos into a litter, upon which, after much reluctance to become such a burden, she was induced, with Jack beside her, to take her place. After the delay thus caused, the procession again started on its perilous route. Dick Sands continued to walk at the head, in order to test the stability of the footing. Action followed, holding Cousin Benedict firmly by the arm. Tom took charge of old Nan, who without his support would certainly have fallen into the quagmire, and the 3 other Negroes carried the litter in the rear. It was a matter of the greatest difficulty to find a path that was sufficiently firm. The method they adopted was to pick their way as much as possible on the long rank grass that on the margin of the swamps was tolerably tough. But in spite of the greatest precaution, there was not one of them who escaped occasionally sinking up to his knees in slush. At about 5 o'clock, they were relieved by finding themselves on ground of a more clayey character. It was still soft and porous below, but its surface was hard enough to give a secure foothold. There were watery pores that percolated the subsoil, and these gave evident witness to the proximity of a river district. The heat would have been intolerably oppressive if it had not been tempered by some heavy storm clouds, which obstructed the direct influence of the sun's rays. Lightning was observed to be playing faintly about the sky, and there was now and again the low growl of distant thunder. The indications of a gathering storm were too manifest to be disregarded, and Dick could not help being very uneasy. He had heard of the extreme violence of African storms, and knew that torrents of rain, hurricanes that no tree could resist, and thunderbolt after thunderbolt were the usual accompaniment of these tempests. And here in this lowland desert, which too surely would be completely inundated, there would not be a tree to which they could resort for shelter, while it would likewise be utterly vain to hope to obtain a refuge by excavation, as water would be found only 2 feet below the surface. Illustration: another brilliant flash brought the camp once again into relief. After scrutinizing the landscape, however, he noticed some low elevations on the north that seemed to form the boundary of the marshy plain. A few trees were scattered along their summits. If his party could get no other shelter here, he hoped they would be able to find themselves free from any danger caused by the rising flood. "Push on, friends, push on," he cried, "3 miles more and we shall be out of this treacherous lowland." His words served to inspire a fresh confidence, and in spite of all the previous fatigue, every energy was brought into play with renewed vigor. Hercules, in particular, seemed ready to carry the whole party, if it had been in his power. The storm was not long in beginning. The rising ground was still 2 miles away. Although the sun was above the horizon, the darkness was almost complete. The overhanging volumes of vapor sank lower and lower towards the earth, but happily the full force of the deluge which must ultimately come did not descend as yet. Lightning, red and blue, flashed on every side and appeared to cover the ground with a network of flame. Ever and again, the little knot of travelers were in peril of being struck by the thunderbolts which, on that treeless plain, had no other object of attraction. Poor little Jack, who had been awakened by the perpetual crashes, buried his face in terror in Hercules' breast, anxious, however, not to distress his mother by any outward exhibition of alarm. The good-natured Negro endeavored to pacify him by promises that the lightning should not touch him, and the child, ever confident in the protection of his huge friend, lost something of his nervousness. But it could not be long before the clouds would burst and discharge the threatened downpour. "What are we to do, Tom?" asked Dick, drawing up close to the Negro's side. "We must make a rush for it, push on with all the speed we can." "But where?" cried Dick. "Straight on," was the prompt reply. "If the rain catches us here on the plain we shall all be drowned." "But where are we to go?" repeated Dick in despair. "If only there were a hut, but look there." A vivid flash of lightning had lit up the country, and Dick declared that he could see a camp which could hardly be more than 1/4 of a mile ahead. The Negro looked doubtful. "I saw it too," he assented, "but if it be a camp at all it would be a camp of natives, and to fall into that would involve us in a worse fate than the rain." Another brilliant flash brought the camp once again into relief. It appeared to be made up of about 100 conical tents, arranged very symmetrically, each of them being from 12 to 15 feet in height. It had the appearance, from a distance, of being deserted. If it were really so, it would afford just the shelter that was needed. Otherwise, at all hazards, it must be most carefully avoided. "I will go in advance," said Dick, after a moment's reflection, "and reconnoiter it." "Let one of us at least go with you," replied Tom. "No, stay where you are. I shall be much less likely to be discovered if I go alone." Without another word, he darted off, and was soon lost in the somber darkness that was only broken by the frequent lightning. Large drops of rain were now beginning to fall. Tom and Dick had been walking some little distance in advance of the rest of the party, who consequently had not overheard their conversation. A halt being made, Mrs. Weldon inquired what was the matter. Tom explained that a camp or village had been noticed a little way in front, and that the captain had gone forward to investigate it. Mrs. Weldon asked no further questions, but quietly waited the result. It was only a few minutes before Dick returned. "You may come on," he cried. "Is the camp deserted?" asked Tom. "It is not a camp at all, it is a lot of anthills." "Anthills," echoed Benedict, suddenly aroused into a state of excitement. Illustration. One after another, the whole party made their way inside. "No doubt of it, Mr. Benedict," replied Dick. "They are anthills 12 feet high at least, and I hope we shall be able to get into them." 12 feet, the naturalist repeated. "They must be those of the termites, the white ants. There is no other insect that could make them. Wonderful architects are the termites." "Termites, or whatever they are, they will have to turn out for us," said Dick. "But they will eat us up," objected Benedict. "I can't help that," retorted Dick. "Go we must, and go at once." "But stop a moment," continued the provoking naturalist. "Stop and tell me. I can't be wrong. I always thought that white ants could never be found elsewhere than in Africa." "Come along, sir, I say, come along quick," shouted Dick, terrified lest Mrs. Weldon should have overheard him. They hurried on. A wind had risen. Large spattering drops were now beginning to fall more heavily on the ground, and in a few minutes it would be impossible to stand against the advancing tempest. The nearest of the accumulation of anthills was reached in time, and however dangerous their occupants might be, it was decided either to expel them or to share their quarters. Each cone was formed of a kind of reddish clay, and had a single opening at its base. Hercules took his hatchet, and quickly enlarged the aperture till it would admit his own huge body. Not an ant made its appearance. Cousin Benedict expressed his extreme surprise, but the structure unquestionably was empty, and one after another the whole party made their way inside. The rain by this time was descending in terrific torrents, strong enough to extinguish, one would think, the most violent explosions of the electric fluid. But the travelers were secure in their shelter, and had nothing to fear for the present. Their tenement was of greater stability than a tent or a native hut. It was one of those marvelous structures erected by little insects, which to Cameron appeared even more wonderful than the upraising of the Egyptian pyramids by human hands. To use his own comparison, it might be likened to the construction of a Mount Everest, the loftiest of the Himalayan peaks, by the united labor of a nation. Chapter 5. White Ants. The storm had now burst in full fury, and fortunate it was that a refuge had been found. The rain did not fall in separate drops as in temperate zones, but descended like the waters of a cataract, in one solid and compact mass, in a way that could only suggest the outpour of some vast aerial basin containing the waters of an entire ocean. Contrary, too, to the storms of higher latitudes, of which the duration seems ordinarily to be in inverse ratio to their violence, these African tempests, whatever their magnitude, often last for whole days, furrowing the soil into deep ravines, changing plains to lakes and brooks to torrents, and causing rivers to overflow and cover vast districts with their inundations. It is hard to understand whence such volumes of vapor and electric fluid can accumulate. The earth, upon these occasions, might almost seem to be carried back to the remote period which has been called the Diluvian Age. Happily, the walls of the anthill were very thick. No beaver hut formed of pounded earth could be more perfectly watertight, and a torrent might have passed over it without a particle of moisture making its way through its substance. As soon as the party had taken possession of the tenement, a lantern was lighted, and they proceeded to examine the interior. The cone, which was about 12 feet high inside, was 11 feet wide at the base, gradually narrowing to a sugar loaf top. The walls and partitions between the tiers of cells were nowhere less than a foot thick throughout. These wonderful erections, the result of the combined labor of innumerable insects, are by no means uncommon in the heart of Africa. Smeathman, a Dutch traveler of the last century, has recorded how he and 4 companions all at one time occupied the summit of one of them in Lound. Livingstone noticed some made of red clay, of which the height varied from 15 to 20 feet, and in Nyangwe, Cameron several times mistook one of these colonies for a native camp pitched upon the plain. He described some of these strange edifices as being flanked with small spires, giving them the appearance of a cathedral dome. The reddish clay of which the ant-hill was composed could leave no doubt upon the mind of a naturalist that it had been formed by the species known as terms bellicosus. Had it been made of gray or black alluvial soil, it might have been attributed to the terms mordax or terms atrox, formidable names that must awaken anything but pleasure in the minds of all but enthusiast entomologists. In the center was an open space, surrounded by roomy compartments, ranged one upon another, like the berths of a ship's cabin, and lined with the millions of cells that had been occupied by the ants. This central space was inadequate to hold the whole party that had now made their hurried resort to it. But as each of the compartments was sufficiently capacious to admit one person to occupy it in a sitting posture, Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Nan, and Cousin Benedict were exalted to the upper tier. Austin, Bat, and Act Aeon occupied the next story, whilst Tom and Hercules, and Dick Sands himself remained below. Dick soon found that the soil beneath his feet was beginning to get damp, and insisted upon having some of the dry clay spread over it from the base of the cone. "It is a long time," he said, "since we have slept with a roof over our heads, and I am anxious to make our refuge as secure as possible. It may be that we shall have to." Illustration: Cousin Benedict's curiosity was awakened. "Stay here for a whole day or more. On the first opportunity, I shall go and explore. It may turn out that we are near the stream we are seeking, and perhaps we shall have to build a raft before we start again." Under his direction, therefore, Hercules took his hatchet, and proceeded to break down the lowest range of cells, and to spread the dry, brittle clay of which they were composed a good foot thick over the damp floor, taking care not in any way to block up the aperture by which the fresh air penetrated into the interior. It was indeed fortunate that the termites had abandoned their home. Had it swarmed with its multitudes of voracious neuroptera, the ant-hill would have been utterly untenable for human beings. Cousin Benedict's curiosity was awakened, and he was intensely interested in the question of the evacuation, so that he proceeded at once to investigate, if he could, whether the emigration had been recent or otherwise. He took the lantern, and as the result of his scrutiny, he soon discovered in a recess what he described as the termites' storehouse, or the place where the indefatigable insects keep their provisions. It was a large cavity, not far from the royal cell, which, together with the cells for the reception of the young larvae, had been destroyed by Hercules in the course of his flooring operations. Out of this receptacle Benedict drew a considerable quantity of gum and vegetable juices, all in a state so liquid as to demonstrate that they had been deposited there quite recently. "They have only just gone," he exclaimed, with an air of authority, as if he imagined that someone was about to challenge his assertion. "We are not going to dispute your word, Mr. Benedict," said Dick. "Here we are, we have taken their place, and shall be quite content for them to keep out of the way, without caring when they went, or where they have gone." "But we must care," retorted Benedict testily. "Why they have gone concerns us a good deal. These juices make it evident, from the liquid state in which we find them, that the ants were here this morning. They have not only gone, but they have carried off their young larvae with them. They have been sagacious enough to take warning of some impending danger." "Perhaps they heard that we were coming," said Hercules, laughing. A look of withering scorn was the only answer that the entomologist deigned to give. "Yes, I say," repeated Hercules, "perhaps they heard that we were coming." "Pshaw," said Benedict contemptuously. "Do you imagine they would be afraid of you? They would reduce your carcass to a skeleton in no time, if they found it across their path." "No doubt, if I were dead," replied Hercules, "they could pick my bones pretty clean, but while I had the use of my limbs I think I could crush them by thousands." "Thousands?" ejaculated Benedict with increasing warmth. "You think you could demolish thousands, but what if they were hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions? Alive as much as dead, I tell you, they wouldn't be long in consuming every morsel of you." During this brisk little discussion, Dick Sands had been pondering over what Benedict had said. There was no doubt that the amateur naturalist was well acquainted with the habits of white ants, and if, as he affirmed, the insects had instinctively quitted their abode on account of some approaching danger, Dick asked himself whether it was safe or prudent for his party to remain. But the fury of the storm was still so great that all possibility of removing from the shelter seemed precluded for the present, and without inquiring farther into the mystery, he merely said, "Although the ants, Mr. Benedict, have left us their provisions, We must not forget that we have brought our own. We will have our supper now, and tomorrow, when the storm is over, we will see what is to be done." Fatigue had not taken away the appetite of the energetic travelers, and they gladly set about the preparation of their meal. The provisions, of which they had enough for. Illustration: the naturalist now fairly mounted on a favorite hobby. Another 2 days had not been injured by the rain. For some minutes the crunching of hard biscuit was the only sound to be heard. Hercules, in particular, seemed to pound away with his huge jaws as with a pair of millstones. Mrs. Weldon was the only one of the party who ate little, and that little was only taken at Dick's earnest solicitation. He could not help noticing, with much concern, that although Jack seemed to be satisfactorily recovering, and without sign of fever, was sleeping calmly enough on a bed made up of clothes spread out in one of the cells, yet his mother had lost much of her courage, and seemed preoccupied and depressed. Cousin Benedict did due honor to the simple evening repast, not on account of its quantity or quality, but because it gave him an opportunity of holding forth upon the subject of termites. He was much vexed that he had been unable to discover a single specimen in the deserted anthill with which he might illustrate his lecture, but notwithstanding this deficiency, he continued to talk, heedless whether anyone was listening. "They are wonderful insects," he said. "They belong to the order of the Neuroptera, which have the antennae longer than the head. Their mandibles are well developed, and the inferior pair of wings is generally as large as the superior. There are 5 families of them: the Panorpide, the Miomelanide, the Hemorrhobiide, the Termitine, and the Perlide. I need hardly say that what we are now occupying is a dwelling of the Termitine." At this point Dick became all attention. He was anxious to ascertain whether this discovery of white ants had aroused any suspicion in Benedict's mind that they must be on African soil. The naturalist, now fairly mounted on a favorite hobby, went on with his discourse. "I am sorry not to have a specimen to show you, but these termitine have 4 joints in the tarsi and strong horny mandibles. The family includes, as genera, the Mantispa, the Raphidia, and the terms, the last commonly known as white ants, amongst which are terms fatales, terms lucifugans, terms mordex, and several others more or less rare." "And which of them built this anthill?" inquired Dick. "The Bellicosi," replied Benedict, pronouncing the name with as much pride as if he were eulogizing the Macedonians or some warlike nation of antiquity. "Bellicosi," he continued, "are to be found of every size. There is as much difference between the largest and the smallest of them as there is between Hercules and a dwarf. The workers are about 1/5 of an inch long. The soldiers, or fighting ants, are 1/2 an inch, whilst the males and females measure 4/5 of an inch. There is another curious species, called surifus, which are about 1/2 an inch long, and have pincers instead of mandibles, and heads larger than their bodies, like sharks. In fact, if sharks and surifus were placed in competition, I should be inclined to back the sharks." "And where are these surifus most generally to be found?" said Dick cautiously. "In Africa, in the southern and central provinces. Africa may truly be termed the land of ants. Livingstone, in the notes brought home by Stanley, describes a battle which he was fortunate enough to witness between an army of black ants and an army of red. The black ants, or drivers, which are what the natives call surifus, got the best of it, and the red ants, or tichungus, after a very resolute defense, were obliged to retire defeated, carrying their eggs and young ones with them. Livingstone avows that he never saw the warlike instinct so strongly developed as in these surifus. The stoutest man, the largest animal, a lion or an elephant, quails before the grip of their mandibles. No obstacle impedes their progress. No tree is too lofty for them to scale, and they contrive to cross wide streams by forming their own bodies into a kind of suspension bridge. Equally amazing are their numbers. Du Chaillu, another African traveler, relates how it took more than 12 hours for a column of ants to file past him, without a moment's pause in their march. These numbers, however, cease to be so surprising when it is explained that their fecundity is such that a single female of the termites bellicosi has been estimated to produce as many as 60,000 eggs a day. These Neuroptera furnish the natives with a favorite food, grilled ants being considered a great delicacy. "Have you ever tasted them?" asked Hercules with a grin.